The moon was low and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every creak sound like a secret being told. In the early hours of June 5, 2002, a bedroom light burned softly as a 14-year-old girl slept within arm's reach of her family. Somewhere outside the walls, something changed. A shadow moved, a door opened, and a life that had been ordinary up to that night would be split into before and after. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. This is the story of a girl who should have been safe in her home, of the 9 months she spent hidden from the world, and of the people who refused to let her remain lost. It is a story about fear, endurance, and the fragile, stubborn human will to survive. It is the story of Elizabeth Smart. The Smart family lived in a tidy Salt Lake City suburb where neighbors knew one another, where children came home for dinner, and where safety felt like an expected part of daily life. The community of Salt Lake City was, in many ways, like any other American town, proud, watchful, trusting. Elizabeth had just turned 14. She was a good student, active in school, nervous about graduation, and those small rites of passage every teenager faces. She played the harp. She had friends. She had plans. A few months before the abduction, an odd encounter planted the first seeds of the tragedy. A man ragged, itinerant, and claiming a religious mission crossed paths with the family. He called himself a prophet and used a different name at times. He did repair work for the Smarts, a job that was small in scope but proved large in consequence. That man was Brian David Mitchell. Traveling with him, and soon acting as an accomplice, was his partner Wanda Barzil, a woman who shared his warped theology and who would take on the role of keeper, instigator, and enforcer during the months that followed. Together, they created a world for Elizabeth that would be isolated, terrifying, and hard to describe to anyone who had not been there. The political climate of the time, the growing use of Amber Alerts, the rise of national media programs that track missing persons, and a public increasingly primed to respond to child abductions would shape how the case unfolded. But none of that would matter in the instant a child's safety was taken from her bedroom. What mattered most in those first hours was recognition, reaction, and the painfully limited tools the family and police had to find a single missing girl in a city of hundreds of thousands. It was a night like so many others. The family returned from a middle school event, they prepared for bed, and the household settled into sleep. In the dark, an intruder entered the Smarts' home and, moving silently between rooms, took what no one expected anyone to take: a daughter, a sister, a child. Elizabeth was taken from her bed while other members of the household slept nearby. Her younger sister witnessed part of the event and would later become one of the case's most important pieces of evidence, a moment of clarity amid confusion and fear. What followed was not a single scene but a months-long nightmare disguised as a journey. The captors moved Elizabeth into a remote camp outside the city, a hidden encampment in Dry Creek Canyon where geography, isolation, and the natural landscape formed a buffer that kept the world at bay. In time, they would also transport her across state lines into California. The two captors cloaked their criminality in religious language and in a twisted set of beliefs that justified their actions in their own minds. For Elizabeth, a teenager trapped in a world of adults whose logic had been inverted, survival became a game of small decisions, quiet compliance when needed, and luck when it could be found. During the months of captivity, she endured repeated abuse at the hands of her captors. She was spoken to in terms that sought to isolate and confuse her sense of truth. She was moved from place to place, hidden under the thin pretext of prophecy. The captors limited her contact with the outside world. They tried to erase the life she had known, layer by layer, Yet even in the deepest shadow of those 9 months, pieces of Elizabeth remained: her wit, her memory of home, and, crucially, the ability to read the behavior of her captors and the moments when an opening might appear. The human instinct to survive found a foothold and clung there. And that foothold would matter more than anyone could guess at first glance. When the Smart family realized Elizabeth was gone, panic became motion. Missing person posters multiplied. Neighborhoods were canvassed. The case quickly gained public attention. The police launched a full investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation issued alerts. The family's despair turned outward into action. They spoke to the media, appealed for tips, and kept the case alive in the public mind. Every lead, every rumor, and every sighting had to be followed. Early leads were numerous, and yet frustratingly thin. As in many missing person cases, the investigation took investigators into a tangled web of false reports and dead ends. The captors, clever in their simplicity, had chosen remote locations that were hard to surveil and had moved Elizabeth to different regions, complicating the search radius. The passage of time hardened the investigation. Each day without a confirmed sighting felt like sand pouring through the hourglass. One of the most important breakthroughs in the case came not from high technology or an international tip line, but from ordinary people paying attention. A publicized sketch and the family's steadfast outreach spurred people to look closely at faces and vehicles they might otherwise have ignored. Local citizens reported sightings, and one such sighting led investigators along the path that would eventually end the months of uncertainty. This pattern of public vigilance and careful police work converging would be the mechanism that brought Elizabeth back. The investigators also followed the men who had been seen in and around the Smart family's life prior to the abduction. The prior interaction between the Smarts and the man who called himself a prophet was not overlooked. That man's name came into focus, and investigators began to build a picture: a drifter claiming prophetic authority, a partner who enabled and abetted him, and an increasingly disturbing trail of behavior. As the search shifted from random tips to persons of interest, the threads began to come together. The final break came when two passers-by recognized the couple walking in a city neighborhood and realized something was wrong. They contacted police. The interaction that followed was cautious and deliberate. Officers approached, began to speak with the pair, and realized they were looking at people of interest. In that conversation, Elizabeth, who had by that point been forced into a false, controlled silence, found a way to communicate. She gave the officers subtle signs that convinced them to investigate further. In a matter of hours, she was free. On March 12, 2003, authorities rescued Elizabeth Smart, and the nation exhaled. Rescues like these are cinematic in memory: blue lights flashing, family members running toward one another, cameras capturing the reunion. But the rescue itself was quieter, built on the accumulation of ordinary citizens doing their duty and officers following a tip. Through careful procedure, it was the watching eyes of two passers-by, the persistence of listeners who had recognized the couple from a sketch, and the nerve of a young woman who managed to find her moment to be seen. When Elizabeth stepped from the custody of her abductors and into the arms of law enforcement, the world felt both unbearably raw and fiercely hopeful. The details of how she convinced officers to believe her, a mix of a subtle reply, a delayed reaction, and a gesture that made the officers question the couple's narrative, are testimony to the intuition and bravery shown in a small window of time. She had survived months of manipulation. She had learned to speak only when she could ensure it would mean safety. Those soft choices, the ones that happen under pressure and in single seconds, were the difference between remaining hidden and returning home. Elizabeth's rescue was followed by immediate arrests. The suspects, now clearly identified and taken into custody, would soon face both intense public scrutiny, and the full weight of the law. The initial emotional rush of reunion was only the beginning of a much longer process. Legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and years of personal recovery for Elizabeth and her family. Once the captors were in custody, the legal system took over, building a case that would lead to justice required careful documentation of the crimes and testimony that could withstand cross-examination. The prosecution had to prove not only the abduction but the repeated abuses Elizabeth suffered during the months she was missing. Evidence was compiled and charges mounted. Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty in federal court to charges related to the kidnapping and transportation of Elizabeth. Part of the federal case resolution included stipulations that meant Elizabeth would not have to testify at a federal trial, a decision made in part to spare the victim further trauma. Barzee received significant federal time, and in subsequent state proceedings additional penalties were imposed. The combined federal state sentences for Barzee reached into the mid-teens in years. For Brian David Mitchell, the legal process was more protracted. He attempted various legal defenses over many years, at times claiming delusions of prophetic instruction, and at others resisting conviction on competency grounds. Ultimately, federal prosecutors pursued the harshest penalties available. The sentence was the culmination of a long legal struggle to ensure that the gravity of his crimes was reflected in the punishment. These outcomes closed a significant chapter in the official timeline of the crime, yet the practical and moral questions of responsibility, of how to prevent similar abuses, and of what rehabilitation or punishment should look like continued to circulate in public conversations. The sentences were intended to deliver justice, but for survivors, legal resolutions are only one part of a much larger healing equation. When a person returns from captivity, there are immediate needs, medical, psychological, and relational, that must be addressed. For Elizabeth, the months and years following her rescue were dedicated to reclaiming a life that had been interrupted. She and her family moved through counseling, careful reintegration into school and community life, and the slow process of reclaiming ordinary joys. But Elizabeth's path after rescue was not solely private. She chose, over time, to use her experience as the basis for public advocacy. She became a visible voice for survivors of sexual violence and for policies that protect children. She co-founded a foundation focused on child safety and became an outspoken advocate for prevention measures and support for victims. Her willingness to speak publicly was not a performance for attention. It was a deliberate effort to make something good. Policy change, awareness, and support networks flow out of something terrible. As years passed, the public record of the case continued to be revisited. Documentaries, books, interviews, and retrospectives explored the sequence of events, the psychology of the captors, and the resilience of the survivor. Some of those retellings were thoughtful and sensitive. Others veered toward sensationalism. Elizabeth herself has at times been vocal about the need for ethical, survivor-centered portrayals. The case became a reference point in discussions about how the media covers trauma, how law enforcement can improve responses to missing person cases, and how communities can better identify and respond to predatory behavior. There has also been controversy. Wanda Barzee completed her primary sentences and was released from prison in 2018, a development that prompted public outcry and continued legal monitoring. Barzee's subsequent interactions with the law, including alleged parole violations in the years after her release, reopened wounds for the Smart family and raised questions about the long-term supervision of convicted sex offenders. The public debate over Barzee's release and behavior has been painful for Elizabeth and her supporters, and it remains a part of the long tail of the case. Meanwhile, Brian David Mitchell remains in prison serving the life sentence handed down for his role in the abduction. His incarceration is a reminder that the state's strongest sanction remains the only route to permanently removing him from society. Yet prison does not erase what happened, nor does it fully address the ripple effects the crime had on a family and on a community's sense of safety. Legal outcomes and media attention are measurable. The private costs are not. For survivors and families, trauma reshapes the simplest things. A habit, a sound, a scent can become a trigger. Rebuilding after such a violent disruption requires therapy, patience, and support from loved ones. Elizabeth's family, who had their own public journey through grief and renewed hope, weathered the spotlight while also protecting their daughter's space to heal. Resilience here is not a single act of heroism. It is a series of days, each one claimed slowly and sometimes painfully. Elizabeth's decision to speak at schools, to educate lawmakers, and to write about her experience has been part of her healing narrative. These choices were not obvious or easy. Making trauma public can sometimes compound pain, yet she has repeatedly framed her public life as one choice among many. A choice to try to prevent others from suffering in the same way and to help build systems that offer better protection and care. For victims, the family's role in recovery was also crucial. Their determination to keep Elizabeth's story alive, not for sensational headlines, but to ensure the world paid attention to the problem of missing children, helped push institutions to adapt. The Smarts worked with law enforcement, supported policy initiatives, and participated in public conversation about prevention. Those contributions softened the isolation that too often follows private trauma by reminding victims everywhere that there is a path, however difficult, toward reintegration. The Elizabeth Smart case did not exist in a vacuum. It lived at the intersection of public policy, media ethics, and community responsibility. The rescue depended heavily on ordinary citizens recognizing something off and contacting authorities. Community attention can be a force multiplier for law enforcement. Decisions made in prosecutorial strategy, such as plea agreements that spare a victim from testifying, can balance the need for justice with the imperative to avoid re-traumatization. The aftermath of the case prompted reviews of design to protect children and track known offenders. These lessons are imperfect roadmaps, but they offer a blueprint for making communities safer and for shaping public institutions that respond more effectively when a child is missing. There is a tension that runs through stories like this one, a contrast between the smallness of a single moment and the vastness of its consequences. A child taken from her bed becomes, overnight, a national story. Neighbors become witnesses, tipsters become heroes, and ordinary small acts aggregate into the exceptional. Elizabeth Smart's 9 months in captivity were concentrated horror, one that no family or community wants to imagine. Her survival and her courage to turn toward advocacy transformed private suffering into a public force for change. The measure of justice in a case like this is not only whether the perpetrators are punished, but whether lessons are learned and applied so that fewer families face the same nightmare. If there is a single, stubborn hope buried in a story that begins with darkness, it is that human beings can both break and rebuild. Elizabeth's life after rescue, her activism, her family, and her willingness to face the world testifies to that hope. Her experience asks us to be vigilant, to be kind, and to remember that safety is never merely the product of laws and enforcement. It is also the accumulation of small, collective acts of care. As you close this episode and return to your day, consider this. The difference between a missing child and a child found often lies in the attention we pay, the calls we make, and the courage we summon. In a few seconds of recognition, in the choice to act, ordinary people can save a life. That is the legacy of this story, a call not just to remember, but to be ready.